Dr. Darius Ellison sat handcuffed in the back of a patrol car, watching Officer Brent Callahan examine his midnight blue Tesla Model S as if it were evidence at a crime scene. His NASA security credential lay confiscated on the hood. His phone vibrated endlessly with missed calls from Langley Air Force Base. What had begun as a routine stop for groceries in the heart of Austin had become the incident that would expose decades of systemic racism, trigger a federal investigation, and ultimately transform police accountability across America forever. Darius Ellison pulled into the Whole Foods parking lot on South Lamar. His sleek Tesla gleamed under the Texas sun. As the principal propulsion systems engineer for NASA's Artemis program, he had spent the morning reviewing classified rocket designs that would carry humanity back to the moon. The equations still danced through his mind as he parked between a lifted pickup and a BMW, both belonging to white customers who had entered the store without incident. High wore his usual weekend attire: khaki pants, a navy polo embroidered with the MIT logo, and his father's vintage watch, a gift celebrating his doctorate in aerospace engineering from America's most prestigious technical university. Adjusting the rearview mirror, he noticed a patrol car parked across the street, its occupant watching with unusual intensity. Officer Brent Callahan had been observing from that exact position for some time. This was no random patrol assignment and no coincidence. Callahan had specifically requested this zone after hearing department gossip that educated black professionals were moving into the traditionally white neighborhoods of South Austin, bringing property values and cultural shifts that threatened his comfort. He had already run the Tesla's plates twice through the system, frustrated each time when they returned clean, registered to Dr. Darius Ellison at a prestigious address overlooking Lake Travis, with an immaculate driving record spanning many years and not even a single parking ticket. The vehicle had been purchased outright only recently, financed neither through loans nor questionable arrangements, but through the substantial salary of a federal contractor whose expertise commanded respect in international aerospace circles. As Darius walked toward the store entrance, his confident stride and professional bearing triggered something primitive in Callahan's psyche, a resentment born of years spent believing that certain people should know their place in the hierarchy. Callahan radioed dispatch with carefully crafted concerns about suspicious activity involving a possible vehicle theft in progress. His voice carried practiced authority despite the complete absence of any supporting evidence. Dispatcher Helen Torres, a veteran who had learned to recognize Callahan's pattern of targeting black motorists through coded language and invented observations, logged the call with reluctance. Internally, she questioned his motives and wondered whether she should document her concerns through proper channels. She had witnessed too many incidents in which Callahan's prejudices created problems for innocent citizens. Yet department culture discouraged questioning fellow officers, especially those with connections inside the police union's leadership structure. Darius emerged from Whole Foods a short while later, carrying organic produce for dinner that evening with his fiancée, Dr. Sophia Morales, a pediatric surgeon at the Children's Hospital, who had saved countless young lives through her surgical precision and medical expertise. He placed the groceries in the Tesla's trunk with methodical care, completely unaware that Callahan had spent the intervening time constructing a case in his imagination, inventing probable cause that existed nowhere outside his prejudiced assumptions about black Americans and luxury vehicles. Afternoon sunlight cast sharp shadows across the parking lot as families moved between cars loaded with weekend groceries. Their casual conversations and ordinary activities provided a stark contrast to the tension building around Darius's simple shopping trip. Callahan approached with his hand resting near his weapon, his body language conveying aggressive authority designed to intimidate rather than investigate. His voice carried the authoritarian tone of someone accustomed to immediate obedience as he ordered Darius to step away from the vehicle. Though no crime had occurred and no violation had been observed, Darius remained still, the grocery receipt still clenched in his right hand. His engineer's mind immediately calculated the risk factors in this unexpected encounter, while his heart rate rose in response to the officer's hostile attitude. Years of guidance on how to interact with police in racially charged situations flooded his memory. He responded with careful courtesy, asking if there was any problem while maintaining non-threatening body language that he hoped would de-escalate any misunderstanding. Callahan demanded to know whose car Darius was driving. The question was loaded with the assumption that someone who looked like Darius could not possibly own such an expensive vehicle, despite the obvious evidence of legitimate ownership surrounding them. Darius explained that the vehicle belonged to him, sir. His respectful tone reflected both his upbringing and his understanding that any perceived disrespect could escalate the situation beyond his control. Callahan's radio crackled with routine traffic updates from other units handling real police business across the city, but he was no longer listening to anything except his own prejudices and the sound of his authority being challenged by someone who refused to accept the subordinate role racism demanded. He focused entirely on proving his predetermined theory that this black man represented some form of criminal activity, even though every piece of available evidence contradicted his assumptions and supported Darius's legitimate presence in the parking lot. When Callahan demanded to see license and registration, Darius moved slowly toward his wallet while narrating every movement to avoid triggering the officer's clearly elevated suspicions. Despite the growing fear that this routine grocery stop had become something far more dangerous, he presented his Texas driver's license, which clearly showed his name, address, and a clean driving history dating back to his 18th birthday, along with a professional photograph showing him in the same attire he wore that day. Callahan examined the identification with exaggerated suspicion, as if document forgery expertise were part of basic training rather than a specialized skill requiring years of study and sophisticated equipment. His skeptical expression suggested that a legitimate government-issued ID was somehow suspicious when presented by certain citizens. The parking lot began filling with afternoon shoppers loading designer bags and pushing carts full of organic produce. Their casual interactions with security guards and parking attendants highlighted the different treatment Darius received from law enforcement, despite his evident belonging to the same socioeconomic class. Darius noticed the contrast but remained focused on de-escalating the confrontation, hoping that compliance and respectability would outweigh whatever prejudice was driving this officer's behavior toward him. When Callahan declared that the license did not prove ownership of the vehicle, he was introducing a legal standard that exists nowhere in Texas law or police procedure, creating requirements no citizen should be expected to meet during a routine traffic encounter. Darius offered to provide registration and insurance documentation, maintaining his cooperative attitude despite the increasingly evident racial motivations behind the detention. His voice carried the patience of someone who had faced similar challenges throughout his professional career. The Tesla's glove compartment revealed perfectly organized paperwork, including registration papers, comprehensive insurance coverage, and his NASA security credential displaying the distinctive holographic features that make forgery practically impossible. The sight of federal credentials should have ended the encounter immediately, transforming it from a suspicious investigation into a respectful interaction between law enforcement and a government contractor whose work contributes to American technological superiority. Instead, the credential triggered something darker in Callahan's psychology, challenging his fundamental beliefs about intelligence, achievement, and racial hierarchy in ways his worldview could not accommodate. His question about where Darius had obtained the credential carried implications that revealed the depth of his prejudice, suggesting that someone with Darius's appearance could not possibly have earned such a prestigious federal position through merit and qualification. Darius explained his role as an aerospace engineer working on the Artemis lunar program. His voice carried quiet pride in work that represented the pinnacle of human technological achievement. Though he could sense that his credentials were being received as suspicious rather than impressive, Callahan's disbelief transformed into open hostility as Darius's qualifications challenged every stereotype and assumption that had shaped the officer's worldview since childhood. Callahan resolved the cognitive dissonance by doubling down on his prejudices rather than examining the flaws in his mental framework. In Callahan's mind, black men did not become rocket scientists, nor did they drive luxury vehicles through legitimate means. They stole them. His next words revealed the dangerous depths of his racial animosity when he announced his intention to arrest Darius for vehicle theft. The moment crystallized everything wrong with American policing when prejudice overrides evidence, training, and basic human decency, transforming a distinguished federal employee into a criminal suspect based solely on the color of his skin and the officer's racist assumptions. Darius's phone began vibrating with urgent calls displaying Langley AFB Urgent on the caller ID, indicating he was expected at a classified briefing to discuss propulsion modifications that could significantly advance the Artemis timeline and maintain American leadership in space exploration. His attempt to explain the urgency fell on ears deafened by prejudice. Callahan had already committed to his narrative and could not retreat without admitting the fundamental error of his assumptions and actions. The handcuffs clicked into place as Saturday shoppers began recording with their smartphones, transforming Darius's personal humiliation into public entertainment, while his dignity became collateral damage in one man's war against black excellence and achievement. As Officer Callahan forced Darius into the patrol car with unnecessary roughness, the engineer's phone continued its relentless vibration, not with calls from his fiancée or concerned colleagues, but from the National Security Agency's Threat Assessment Division, activated automatically when Darius missed his scheduled check-in for a classified briefing that could determine America's timeline for returning astronauts to the lunar surface. At NASA headquarters in Washington, D.C., Dr. Lena Cho, Director of Personnel Security, stared at her computer screen with growing disbelief. Darius Ellison's security beacon had disconnected during what should have been routine personal time between his morning design review and afternoon strategy session. His top-level clearance required constant monitoring when outside secure facilities, especially before critical mission planning sessions, where his expertise guided decisions affecting billions of dollars in aerospace contracts and international partnerships with allied space agencies. She instructed her assistant to run the GPS tracking again, desperately hoping for a system error or technical glitch. But the coordinates consistently placed Darius in a Whole Foods parking lot where no security threat should exist for someone of his clearance level and professional status. Her stomach dropped as recognition struck. She had witnessed this pattern before during her career managing security for high-clearance federal employees. Local law enforcement detaining government contractors, without understanding the national security implications of their actions, or the required protocols when interfering with classified personnel. She immediately activated Protocol 7, an emergency procedure designed specifically for situations in which authorized personnel face possible compromise, detention, or unauthorized contact with foreign agents. Within moments, automated alerts reached the Pentagon's Crisis Management Center, the FBI's Counterintelligence Division, and General Patricia Harlan, the Air Force officer overseeing NASA's military partnerships and security coordination. Darius sat handcuffed in the back of the patrol car, watching through the bulletproof glass as Callahan inventoried the contents of his Tesla like a treasure hunter, documenting evidence of some elaborate international conspiracy rather than a simple case of mistaken assumptions based on racial prejudice. The officer photographed the vehicle's interior with methodical precision, capturing images of the classical music collection, the MIT parking permit, even the roadside emergency kit, as if these ordinary possessions somehow proved criminal activity rather than the normal lifestyle of an educated professional. Other shoppers began gathering around the perimeter established by yellow police tape, their smartphones capturing every moment as social media algorithms amplified the incident across digital platforms with hashtags that would soon trend nationally and internationally. Among the growing crowd stood attorney Isabella Reyes, a civil rights lawyer whose decade of litigation against police departments had taught her to recognize the telltale signs of racial profiling and constitutional violations. She positioned herself strategically to ensure her video captured Callahan's face and badge number with crystal clarity for the legal proceedings that would inevitably follow this evident misconduct. At the Pentagon's Secure Communications Center, General Harlan reviewed Darius's classified file with growing alarm and disbelief at what she was reading about the man currently detained by Austin police without federal oversight or coordination. Dr. Darius Ellison was not simply any NASA engineer or routine government contractor. He was the principal designer of the Artemis program's revolutionary propulsion system, representing a quantum leap in rocket technology and possessing knowledge and classified information that foreign governments would pay millions to acquire through espionage or coercion. His detention by local police without federal supervision represented a potential security breach of extraordinary magnitude, the kind of incident that generates congressional investigations and international diplomatic complications when foreign intelligence services learn of vulnerabilities in American security protocols. The general picked up her secure phone and dialed the main number of the Austin Police Department with the urgency of someone managing a national security crisis. Her voice carried the authority of decades dedicated to protecting American military and aerospace assets from foreign interference. The desk sergeant, accustomed to handling routine civilian complaints and minor administrative issues, initially treated her call as another citizen grievance that could be redirected through the normal bureaucratic channels designed to minimize departmental liability. When the sergeant suggested she file a formal complaint through the Civilian Review Board, General Harlan's response carried the weight of federal authority and national security concerns that transcended local police procedures and protocols. She gave the sergeant 30 seconds to connect her with the police chief, or this would become a matter for the Department of Homeland Security, with all the federal intervention and scrutiny such escalation would bring to the Austin Police Department. The line went silent as the magnitude of the situation began penetrating the department's administrative layers, followed by frantic transfers among supervisors, who suddenly realized they were dealing with federal authorities and national security implications far beyond their usual jurisdiction. Back in the parking lot, Callahan had convinced himself that he had uncovered an elaborate fraud involving forged federal documents and vehicle theft. He requested backup units to help process what he described to dispatch as a sophisticated identity theft operation involving federal credentials and luxury vehicles. His radio crackled with responses from officers Rachel Vance and Carlos Mendez, who approached the scene with the casual confidence of officers responding to what they believed was a routine property crime arrest, unaware that they were about to become secondary characters in a national controversy that would define their careers and transform public discourse about racial profiling in American law enforcement. Darius watched with growing despair as 2 additional patrol cars arrived with lights flashing, their presence transforming his personal humiliation into a major police incident that drew even more attention from bystanders and news crews monitoring police scanners for weekend stories. Officer Vance asked Callahan for a situation report, examining the Tesla with the same suspicious intensity as her colleague, while Darius remained handcuffed and powerless to explain the obvious truth of his legitimate ownership and federal employment. Callahan described his prisoner as a black man in his late 30s who claimed to own the expensive vehicle and work for NASA. His tone suggested that both claims were obviously fraudulent, and that the supporting documents were sophisticated forgeries requiring federal investigation. Officer Mendez, a 12-year military veteran whose background included security clearances and federal contracting experience, immediately noticed significant discrepancies between Callahan's narrative and the actual evidence in front of them. Yet departmental loyalty and the thin blue line culture prevented him from openly questioning his colleague's judgment, even when that judgment appeared fundamentally flawed. The Tesla's registration documents displayed security features and official seals that would be nearly impossible to forge without sophisticated equipment and insider knowledge, while the NASA credential included holographic elements and embedded chips representing millions of dollars in anti-counterfeiting technology. Darius's phone rang again with increasing urgency, the caller ID now displaying General Harlan, Pentagon, in letters large enough for the gathering crowd to read. Although the significance of receiving calls from military leadership did not penetrate Callahan's consciousness or alter his commitment to the arrest he had already initiated, Darius called out through the patrol car window, explaining that a Pentagon general was trying to reach him about classified government work affecting national security and space exploration. His desperation grew as he realized his detention was creating complications far beyond personal humiliation. Callahan's response revealed the depth of his contempt for both Darius and the federal credentials he had presented. He dismissed the urgent calls with a flippant suggestion that Darius could explain everything to a judge, as if the American legal system were designed to resolve the racist assumptions of local police officers. At NASA headquarters, Dr. Lena Cho received automated confirmation that Darius had missed his mandatory security check-in, activating the Emergency Personnel Recovery Protocol, typically reserved for situations involving possible kidnapping, foreign intelligence operations, or terrorist activities targeting cleared personnel. The protocol automatically notified 17 federal agencies, including the Secret Service, CIA, NSA, and Department of Homeland Security, creating a cascade of bureaucratic responses that would soon overwhelm the Austin Police Department with federal attention and scrutiny. Within minutes of activation, Darius Ellison's detention transformed from a local police matter into a federal incident requiring immediate resolution and thorough investigation, his personal humiliation becoming a catalyst for examining systemic problems in law enforcement's treatment of successful black professionals. General Harlan placed her call to Chief Samuel Briggs in his office, where he was enjoying a quiet Saturday afternoon reviewing departmental budget proposals, completely unaware that one of his officers had created a situation requiring immediate damage control and federal cooperation. When Briggs answered, he initially treated the call as routine military liaison business, the kind of cooperative interaction between federal and local authorities that usually involves scheduling meetings or sharing intelligence about potential security threats in the Austin area. General Harlan explained that one of his officers was currently detaining Dr. Darius Ellison, a critical NASA contractor with the highest level security clearance, whose work involved classified information requiring congressional oversight, even to discuss in general terms. Her voice carried the measured authority of someone accustomed to managing international crises, yet Briggs could detect the underlying tension and urgency indicating this was no routine coordination call. Chief Briggs's blood pressure spiked as he began to grasp the magnitude of the situation unfolding in his jurisdiction. He immediately opened the incident report in the department's computer system and reviewed Callahan's preliminary documentation, filled with subjective observations, unsupported assumptions, and glaring omissions of exculpatory evidence. The report described Darius as suspicious and evasive, despite video evidence showing his complete cooperation, and characterized his federal credentials as questionable, without any basis for such skepticism beyond the officer's personal prejudices. General Harlan continued her explanation, describing Dr. Ellison's role in designing propulsion systems for America's return to the moon, and his status as one of the nation's leading experts in advanced rocket technology, knowledge so sensitive that foreign governments maintain active intelligence operations targeting individuals with his expertise and access. Every minute Darius remained in custody without proper security increased the risk of compromise, whether through foreign surveillance of American law enforcement communications or simply through his absence from classified briefings that disrupted national security operations worth billions of dollars and years of international cooperation. The crowd in the parking lot continued growing as news spread through social media and local news outlets, with several television crews arriving after monitoring police scanners and recognizing the potential significance of federal personnel being detained by local authorities. Darius watched reporters setting up cameras and adjusting satellite equipment, understanding that his private humiliation was becoming a public spectacle that would define him in ways completely disconnected from his professional achievements and personal character, transforming him from a respected engineer into a symbol for whatever narrative emerged from this incident. Chief Briggs's radio crackled with urgent updates as he raced toward the Whole Foods parking lot, emergency lights cutting through Saturday afternoon traffic while his mind raced through the possible consequences of this unprecedented situation involving federal personnel and national security protocols. FBI Special Agent Raj Patel and Department of Homeland Security Coordinator Nadia Reyes followed in unmarked vehicles, their presence transforming what had begun as a simple arrest into a federal incident requiring immediate coordination among multiple agencies and levels of government that rarely intersect in local police work. The scene had evolved dramatically since Callahan first approached Darius with his unfounded suspicions, expanding from a single patrol car into a complex multi-agency law enforcement operation involving federal agents, media crews, and growing crowds of spectators whose smartphone videos were already spreading across social media platforms with viral intensity. Local news vans surrounded the parking lot perimeter like modern covered wagons, their satellite antennas extending toward the sky like technological sentinels, broadcasting this incident to audiences far beyond Austin's city limits, as reporters adjusted equipment and prepared for live shots that would carry the story into living rooms across America within the hour. Shoppers pressed against the yellow police tape that now spanned most of the parking lot, their phones recording every moment as the story spread across digital platforms with hashtags such as #NASA-engineer and #driving-while-black, creating a real-time documentary of racial profiling and its consequences in contemporary American society. Darius remained handcuffed in the back of the patrol car, watching through the bulletproof glass as federal agents established a command perimeter 50 yards from Callahan's position. Their professional coordination and sophisticated equipment created a stark contrast with the local police response that had initiated this crisis. The arresting officer stood beside the Tesla with the stubborn determination of someone who cannot admit error without destroying his self-image. Still convinced he had uncovered criminal activity despite growing evidence of his fundamental mistake and mounting federal pressure to release his prisoner. Agent Patel approached Callahan with credentials that immediately established federal jurisdiction and authority, superseding local law enforcement in matters involving classified personnel and national security concerns. His voice carried the measured professionalism of someone accustomed to managing complex multi-agency investigations involving competing interests. When Patel ordered the immediate release of Dr. Ellison, his directive carried the weight of federal law and national security protocols that transcend local police authority. Yet Callahan's response revealed his complete misunderstanding of the situation's gravity and of his own legal obligations when federal agencies assume jurisdiction. He insisted he had probable cause to believe Darius had stolen the vehicle and forged federal documents, his words demonstrating a level of delusion and racial prejudice that prevented him from recognizing the obvious legitimacy of the evidence before him or the federal credentials being presented by multiple agencies. The words hung in the air like a direct challenge to federal authority that could not be ignored without undermining the government's ability to protect classified personnel and maintain national security protocols, creating a confrontation between local prejudice and federal responsibility that would have lasting consequences for everyone involved. Dr. Lena Cho arrived by helicopter from NASA's Johnson Space Center, her rapid deployment demonstrating the government's serious response to potential threats against critical personnel. She crossed the parking lot with the confidence of someone accustomed to managing national security crises involving America's most sensitive aerospace technology and international partnerships. Her presence immediately shifted the dynamics from a local police incident to a federal security operation, her NASA credentials and security escort making clear that this situation involved national interests far beyond the scope of routine law enforcement activities that typically occupy local police departments. Agent Patel briefed her on the current status while maintaining eye contact with Darius, explaining that Dr. Ellison remained in local police custody despite federal requests for his immediate release, and the evident lack of evidence supporting the arrest that had initiated this confrontation. Cho's expression hardened as she processed the information and observed Callahan's continued defiance of federal authority, recognizing that this incident represented not only a personal injustice, but a fundamental violation of security protocols designed to protect America's most valuable scientific and technological assets. When she approached Callahan directly, her introduction as NASA's Director of Personnel Security should have ended his resistance immediately. Instead, his response demonstrated how deeply racial prejudices can override professional judgment and legal obligations, even when confronted with overwhelming evidence and authority. Callahan dismissed her concerns with contemptuous disregard, stating that he did not care if Darius claimed to work for the president himself, because he believed he had a car thief in custody and intended to follow what he considered proper procedures, even though those procedures violated both constitutional rights and federal security protocols. The crowd gasped audibly at his dismissive tone toward federal authority, their reactions captured by dozens of cell phone cameras ensuring that Callahan's defiance would be preserved forever in digital memory and as legal evidence, creating a permanent record of his misconduct and its consequences. Darius watched this jurisdictional battle unfold while understanding that his professional reputation and personal dignity had become the center of a conflict he never chose to fight. His life was transforming from private success into a public symbol in ways that would affect his career and relationships regardless of the final resolution. Dr. Mateo Alvarez, project director and Darius's mentor, arrived from NASA's Johnson Space Center with several other colleagues whose security clearances and federal credentials created a striking visual contrast with local law enforcement's assumptions about who belongs in positions of scientific authority and technological leadership. Alvarez approached Chief Briggs with barely contained fury, his voice carrying the frustration of someone who had spent decades fighting systemic racism in technical fields and watching talented colleagues face discrimination, despite their obvious qualifications and contributions to American competitiveness. The project director explained that Briggs's department had arrested the principal engineer of America's next lunar mission based purely on racial assumptions, creating an international incident that could damage relationships with allied space agencies and compromise years of technological development valued at billions of dollars in research and manufacturing contracts. Briggs's face drained of color as he began to comprehend the full magnitude of Callahan's error and its potential consequences for his department's reputation, federal relationships, and his own career prospects in law enforcement administration. He realized that media attention would scrutinize every aspect of his department's training, hiring, and accountability measures. Coordinator Nadia Reyes activated her secure communications device, connecting directly with the Department of Homeland Security's Operations Center in Washington, D.C., where senior officials were already monitoring the situation and preparing response protocols that could transform federal oversight of local law enforcement agencies nationwide. Her report described a situation in which local police refused to release a top-level classified contractor despite federal intervention, creating unprecedented tensions between law enforcement agencies and requiring immediate guidance on federal intervention protocols designed for international crises rather than domestic racial incidents. The Department of Homeland Security's response arrived within minutes, authorizing federal authorities to take custody of Dr. Ellison under national security provisions that supersede local law enforcement authority and establishing protocols for investigating possible civil rights violations that may have compromised classified personnel and operations. Callahan remained unaware that his career was ending in real time, continuing to defend his actions before growing numbers of federal officials, while demonstrating the depth of his racial prejudice and professional incompetence through every word and gesture captured by media coverage that would define this incident for years. His insistence that Darius did not fit the profile of someone who could afford expensive transportation or work for NASA revealed the fundamental racism driving his actions, exposing beliefs about racial hierarchy and intellectual capacity that have no place in modern law enforcement or American society. Darius's fiancée, Dr. Sophia Morales, arrived after receiving frantic calls from colleagues who had seen the developing news coverage. She pushed through the crowd with the determined urgency of someone fighting for the person she loved. Her surgical scrub still carried traces of the emergency operation she had left to be here. Her medical training immediately recognized signs of psychological trauma in Darius's posture and facial expressions, understanding that this incident would have lasting emotional and professional consequences, regardless of its legal resolution. Her presence added another dimension of human cost to what had begun as routine shopping and become a national controversy. When she demanded to know where they were holding Darius, Agent Patel's respectful response acknowledged both her professional status and personal relationship while explaining federal efforts to resolve the situation immediately. Though he could not provide the reassurance she needed that this nightmare would end without permanent damage to their lives and careers, she stared at the patrol car where Darius sat handcuffed like a common criminal. Her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to life-or-death medical decisions as she described the complete absurdity of arresting someone who designs rocket engines and holds 3 degrees from MIT for supposedly stealing his own vehicle. These personal details humanized Darius for the growing crowd, transforming him from an abstract victim of racial profiling into a real person whose life and achievements were being destroyed by one officer's prejudices and the system that allows such misconduct to continue, despite decades of civil rights legislation and diversity training. General Harlan arrived in a military helicopter. Her dramatic entrance signaled that this incident now involved the highest levels of the American defense establishment and the national security apparatus. With implications extending far beyond local police jurisdiction, or routine civil rights violations that typically remain confined to local courts and media coverage. She surveyed the scene with the tactical assessment skills of someone who has managed international crises involving military assets and classified operations, understanding immediately that local police had created a situation requiring immediate federal intervention to prevent a major compromise of national security interests and personnel. Her presence represented the full weight of American military authority focused on resolving this incident with resources and legal powers far exceeding anything available to local law enforcement agencies or civilian authorities. Her assessment of the situation would determine how federal agencies respond to similar incidents in the future. When General Harlan assumed command of the scene under federal security protocols, her authority superseded all local law enforcement jurisdiction and established new parameters for resolving this crisis that prioritized national security concerns over local police procedures or the personal prejudices that had initiated the confrontation. Agent Patel acknowledged her command authority while briefing her on the current status and continued local police resistance, explaining that Callahan refused to release Dr. Ellison despite overwhelming evidence of his legitimacy and mounting federal pressure to end this detention immediately before it caused additional security complications. General Harlan ordered the immediate release of Dr. Ellison and his placement in protective custody until federal agencies could assess any security compromise that may have resulted from his unauthorized detention by local authorities lacking appropriate clearance levels or understanding of national security protocols. Callahan's final act of defiance occurred when he insisted he retained jurisdiction over his investigation, regardless of federal involvement, demonstrating a complete misunderstanding of how federal authority functions and of his own legal obligations when national security takes priority over local law enforcement activities that may have compromised classified personnel or operations. General Harlan's response carried the full weight of American military authority as she informed Callahan that his investigation had ended the moment he detained a critical defense contractor without federal coordination and ordered him to step away from the vehicle immediately or face federal charges for interfering with national security operations. The moment of absolute silence that followed preceded the media explosion that would transform this incident into a national conversation about race and justice. Within seconds of her ultimatum, live television crews began broadcasting the confrontation to audiences across America, with CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, and local affiliates interrupting regular programming to cover what producers recognized as a major story combining racial profiling, federal authority, and national security in ways that guaranteed massive viewership and social media amplification. Helicopter footage captured the full scope of the scene. Federal agents surrounding a local police officer who refused to release a handcuffed black man while military personnel established command authority over what had begun as a routine traffic stop, creating images that immediately communicated the extraordinary nature of this confrontation to millions of viewers. Darius watched through the patrol car window as reporters positioned themselves for optimal camera angles, understanding that his personal nightmare was becoming public entertainment and political commentary that would follow him for the rest of his career, regardless of how this incident was ultimately resolved. His image and story were becoming symbols for larger debates about systemic racism that he never chose to represent. Dr. Sophia Morales pushed through the media crowd with the determination of someone who would not be denied access to her fiancé. Her surgical scrubs and medical identification credential created a path through reporters who recognized her importance to the story and began shouting questions about Darius's character, their relationship, and her thoughts on racial profiling in American society. The questions revealed how quickly personal tragedy becomes public spectacle, with journalists seeking emotional reactions and quotable statements that would enhance their coverage without considering the human cost of transforming private citizens into involuntary public figures whose lives would never return to normal privacy. Social media algorithms detected the incident's viral potential and began amplifying hashtags such as #racistcop, #engineer, #justice for Darius, and #driving while black, creating digital momentum that transformed local news into national controversy within minutes of the first posts appearing on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram platforms used by millions of Americans seeking real-time information about developing stories. The live streaming of the incident across multiple platforms created immediate accountability that previous generations of civil rights activists could never have achieved, with every word and action preserved in digital permanence that prevents official denial or historical revision of what actually occurred in this parking lot on this Saturday afternoon in Austin, Texas. Civil rights organizations received alerts about the developing situation through social media monitoring systems designed to identify possible cases of police misconduct and racial discrimination. Within a short time, representatives from the NAACP, ACLU, and Southern Poverty Law Center were en route to Austin with legal resources and media strategies refined through decades of fighting systemic racism in American law enforcement. The regional coordinator of the National Action Network issued a preliminary statement calling for immediate federal investigation and accountability for what he described as a clear case of racial profiling involving a distinguished federal contractor whose only crime was shopping while black in a society that still questions black success and achievement. Dr. Mateo Alvarez offered impromptu interviews to reporters, his voice carrying the measured authority of someone who had spent decades in aerospace engineering while fighting the subtle and overt racism that permeates technical fields despite civil rights legislation and diversity initiatives that fail to address deeply rooted prejudices about intellectual capacity and professional competence. He explained Darius's role in the Artemis program with the passion of someone who understands both the technical brilliance required for such work and the additional barriers black engineers face in achieving recognition for their contributions to American technological leadership and international competitiveness. The interviews humanized Darius beyond the handcuffed figure in the patrol car, revealing his educational achievements, professional accomplishments, and character traits that contradicted every assumption underlying Callahan's arrest, while demonstrating the broader implications of racial profiling for America's ability to retain and develop scientific talent in an increasingly competitive global economy. Congressional offices began receiving calls from constituents demanding immediate action and accountability, with members of the Congressional Black Caucus preparing statements that would call for federal investigation and systematic reform of police training and oversight mechanisms that had clearly failed to prevent this incident, despite decades of civil rights legislation and sensitivity training. Senator Elizabeth Warren's office issued a preliminary statement condemning the arrest as an example of systemic racism that undermines American values and threatens national security by subjecting critical personnel to harassment and detention based on racial prejudice rather than legitimate law enforcement concerns or actual evidence of criminal activity. The statement demanded immediate federal intervention and a thorough review of how local law enforcement agencies interact with federal personnel, particularly those from underrepresented communities who face additional scrutiny and suspicion, despite their obvious qualifications and contributions to national security and technological advancement. International media picked up the story as it unfolded, with BBC, Reuters, and Al Jazeera providing coverage that emphasized America's continuing struggles with racial justice and civil rights, creating diplomatic complications for a nation that promotes democratic values and human rights in international forums, while failing to protect its own citizens from discrimination and constitutional violations. The international attention amplified pressure for rapid resolution and accountability, while foreign observers used this incident to question American moral authority and leadership on human rights issues that affect international relations and cooperative agreements in scientific, military, and economic spheres, where trust and credibility determine success. Darius's former classmates and NASA colleagues began coordinating response efforts through professional networks and social media platforms, with dozens of engineers, scientists, and technical professionals sharing their own experiences of racial profiling and workplace discrimination that revealed the broader context of this incident and its significance for American scientific and technological communities. Their testimonies created a powerful narrative of Black excellence under constant suspicion, documenting the psychological and professional costs of working in fields where competence and belonging are perpetually questioned, despite obvious evidence of qualification and achievement that would be automatically accepted for colleagues of different racial backgrounds. The Massachusetts Institute of Technology issued an official statement supporting its distinguished alumnus and condemning the racial profiling that led to his arrest, with university officials expressing concern about how such incidents affect the recruitment and retention of diverse talent on STEM campuses, where American competitiveness depends on attracting the best minds regardless of racial or ethnic background. The statement emphasized Darius's academic achievements and professional contributions while demanding systemic changes in law enforcement training and accountability that would prevent similar incidents from occurring in the near and foreseeable future, protecting all citizens from discrimination based on racial prejudice rather than legitimate security concerns or actual evidence of criminal activity. NASA Administrator Victor Lang monitored the situation from agency headquarters, coordinating with legal counsel and public affairs specialists to manage the crisis while protecting both Darius's interests and the agency's reputation for professionalism and scientific excellence. Understanding that this incident reflected NASA's commitment to diversity and its ability to protect personnel from harassment and discrimination, the agency prepared comprehensive statements supporting Darius and condemning racial profiling while emphasizing his critical contributions to American space exploration and the success of the Artemis program, making clear that NASA values all employees, regardless of race, and will not tolerate discrimination against personnel who dedicate their careers to advancing human knowledge and American technological leadership. Federal law enforcement agencies began coordinating investigation protocols that would examine not only Callahan's conduct, but also systemic patterns within the Austin Police Department that may have allowed or encouraged such behavior. FBI civil rights investigators prepared to review training materials, personnel files, and complaint records that could reveal broader problems requiring comprehensive intervention. Within 2 hours of Darius's arrest, the FBI's Civil Rights Division established a crisis response team in Austin, with Special Agent Patricia Williams leading an investigation that would ultimately expose a pattern of racial targeting so systematic and deliberate that it shocked even veteran federal investigators who had spent decades documenting police misconduct across America. The team's initial review of Austin Police Department records revealed that Officer Callahan had initiated contact with black motorists at rates 17 times higher than his colleagues, with arrest rates for minor infractions demonstrating clear evidence of discriminatory enforcement patterns that violate federal civil rights laws and constitutional protections. Agent Williams's analysis of Callahan's body camera footage from previous encounters showed a disturbing pattern of escalation and hostility directed specifically at black professionals, with particular attention to those driving expensive vehicles or wearing business attire that challenged his assumptions about appropriate social hierarchy and economic achievement within racial categories. The recordings revealed Callahan's tendency to question legitimate documentation, invent probable cause where none existed, and prolong encounters beyond any reasonable law enforcement purpose, creating a documented history of harassment that transformed Darius's arrest from an isolated incident into a deliberate pattern of civil rights violations requiring federal prosecution and systemic reform. Department of Justice attorneys arrived in Austin with subpoena powers and federal grand jury authority, immediately requesting personnel files, training records, and complaint databases that would reveal how the Austin Police Department hired, trained, and supervised an officer whose conduct clearly violated established legal standards and professional ethics governing modern law enforcement in constitutional democratic societies. The initial document review revealed that Callahan had received numerous civilian complaints alleging racial bias and excessive force, but department supervisors consistently dismissed these complaints without adequate investigation or corrective action, creating an environment where discriminatory conduct could continue without accountability or consequences that might deter future violations. Internal affairs records showed that Callahan's colleagues and supervisors were aware of his targeting behavior, but neither intervened nor reported it through appropriate channels, creating a conspiracy of silence that allowed systematic civil rights violations affecting dozens of black citizens who experienced harassment, detention, and humiliation without legal recourse or protection from their local government. Dr. Lena Cho coordinated with federal investigators to assess possible security violations that may have resulted from Darius's unauthorized detention, reviewing classified protocols and communication systems that could have been compromised during his time in police custody without proper federal supervision or security clearance verification procedures. The security assessment revealed that Darius's phone contained classified technical specifications and meeting schedules that foreign intelligence services would find extremely valuable, creating national security implications that extended far beyond civil rights violations and required immediate protective measures for other NASA personnel with similar clearance levels and expertise. General Harlan testified before a closed congressional hearing about the security risks created by local police interference with federal personnel, explaining how Callahan's actions could have provided foreign adversaries opportunities to gather intelligence on American space programs and defense technologies, representing billions of dollars in research investment and strategic military advantages. Her testimony emphasized that protecting classified personnel requires not only federal security measures but also training and coordination of local law enforcement that prevents incidents like Darius's arrest from creating vulnerabilities that foreign intelligence services actively seek to exploit through various means, including electronic surveillance and human intelligence operations. The House Oversight Committee announced formal hearings examining the intersection of racial profiling and national security, with Chairman James Comer declaring that Congress cannot allow discriminatory policing to compromise federal operations or endanger personnel whose work protects American interests and technological superiority in increasingly competitive global environments where information security determines strategic advantage. The committee's preliminary investigation revealed that similar incidents involving federal contractors and military personnel have occurred in other jurisdictions, suggesting a national pattern of local police interference with national security operations that requires comprehensive policy review and legislative solutions to prevent future security violations caused by racially motivated misconduct. Darius's legal team, led by prominent civil rights attorney Camille Harrington, began building a federal lawsuit that would seek not only compensation for constitutional violations, but also systemic reforms addressing the root causes of racial profiling and its impact on federal operations and personnel security across all American law enforcement agencies. The legal strategy focused on demonstrating how Callahan's conduct represented broader systemic problems within police training, supervision, and accountability structures that allow discriminatory behavior while protecting officers from consequences that might deter similar violations in the future, creating legal precedents that could transform policing procedures nationwide. Harrington's team documented the psychological trauma Darius experienced during his detention with expert testimony from forensic psychologists, describing how racial profiling creates lasting emotional harm that affects victims' personal relationships, professional performance, and willingness to participate fully in American society without fear of harassment or humiliation based on racial prejudice rather than actual conduct. The psychological evaluation revealed symptoms consistent with post-traumatic stress disorder, including hypervigilance, anxiety about police encounters, and social withdrawal that affected Darius's ability to perform his demanding technical work at the level of excellence NASA missions require for success and safety in extremely challenging space exploration environments. Financial experts calculated the economic damages resulting from Darius's arrest, including lost productivity at NASA, security breach costs, and the broader economic impact of discriminatory policing on professional communities that drive American technological innovation and competitive advantage in global markets where talent retention and development determine long-term success. The analysis demonstrated that racial profiling not only harms individual victims, but imposes significant costs on American institutions and industries that depend on diverse talent and inclusive environments to attract and retain the human capital necessary for continued leadership in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics fields where international competition has intensified. Corporate executives from aerospace and defense contractors issued statements condemning racial profiling and supporting federal legislation that would strengthen protections for technical personnel whose work contributes to American economic competitiveness and national security priorities, requiring the best available talent, regardless of racial or ethnic background. Their statements emphasize the business case for civil rights protection, explaining how discriminatory policing affects their ability to recruit and retain diverse workforces that bring different perspectives and capabilities, essential for innovation and problem-solving in complex technical fields, where creativity and collaboration determine success in developing revolutionary technologies. Austin Mayor Gregory Holt, met with federal officials and community leaders to address the crisis, acknowledging that Callahan's conduct had damaged his city's reputation and threatened federal partnerships that bring significant economic benefits and scientific prestige to the Austin metropolitan area, which has positioned itself as a hub for technology and aerospace industries dependent on diverse talent and inclusive environments. The mayor announced immediate reforms including mandatory anti-bias training, enhanced supervision protocols, and civilian oversight mechanisms designed to prevent similar incidents while rebuilding trust between police and communities that have experienced decades of discriminatory treatment, despite constitutional protections and civil rights legislation that should guarantee equal protection under the law for all citizens. Federal prosecutors began presenting evidence to a grand jury seeking indictments against Callahan for civil rights violations under federal statutes carrying significant prison sentences, and establishing legal precedents for protecting federal personnel from harassment and discrimination that could compromise national security operations or create security vulnerabilities foreign adversaries might exploit. The grand jury proceedings included testimony from Darius, his colleagues, and expert witnesses, explaining how racial profiling undermines both individual rights and collective security interests that depend on protecting critical personnel from interference and harassment based on racial prejudice, rather than legitimate law enforcement concerns or actual evidence of criminal activity threatening public safety. 6 months after his arrest, Darius entered the federal courthouse in Austin, where his civil rights lawsuit would challenge not only Officer Callahan's conduct, but the entire system that allowed and protected systematic racial discrimination within the Austin Police Department, with legal proceedings that would establish precedents affecting law enforcement accountability nationwide. The courtroom overflowed with supporters, media representatives, and legal observers who recognized this case's potential to transform police training, supervision, and accountability standards that have failed to prevent discriminatory conduct despite decades of civil rights legislation and constitutional protections that should guarantee equal treatment under the law. Attorney Camille Harrington presented opening arguments framing Darius's arrest as part of a deliberate pattern of racial targeting that violates both individual constitutional rights and collective security interests, requiring the protection of federal personnel from harassment based on racial prejudice rather than legitimate law enforcement concerns or actual evidence of criminal activity. Her presentation included video evidence, statistical analysis, and expert testimony, demonstrating how Callahan's conduct represented broader systemic problems within police culture and training that allowed discriminatory behavior while protecting officers from accountability measures that could deter similar violations affecting other citizens with similar professional achievements and social status. The prosecution's case revealed the depth of Callahan's racial animosity through internal communications, social media posts, and recorded conversations with other officers that exposed beliefs about racial hierarchy and intellectual capacity that have no place in modern law enforcement or a democratic society, creating a documented record of prejudice that explained his conduct toward Darius and other black professionals. Defense attorneys attempted to portray Callahan as a dedicated officer who made reasonable decisions based on available information, but their arguments collapsed when confronted with overwhelming evidence of discriminatory patterns, constitutional violations, and security breaches resulting from his refusal to accept legitimate documentation and federal credentials that should have ended the encounter immediately. The defense strategy failed to address the fundamental question of why Callahan subjected Darius to scrutiny and suspicion. He never would have applied to white citizens in identical circumstances, revealing the inherent weakness of arguments that attempt to justify racial profiling by appealing to officer discretion and professional judgment. Darius took the stand to describe his experience in his own words, explaining how the incident transformed him from a respected federal contractor into a criminal suspect based solely on racial assumptions that contradicted every piece of available evidence, including his identification, registration, insurance, and NASA security credential that should have commanded respect rather than suspicion. His testimony revealed the psychological impact of being treated as presumptively criminal despite obvious evidence of legitimate achievement and social contribution, describing how the experience affects his daily interactions with law enforcement and his confidence in American institutions that claim to protect constitutional rights while failing to prevent systematic discrimination. The emotional weight of Darius's testimony moved several jurors to tears as he described watching his professional reputation and personal dignity become subjects for public debate and media speculation, transforming his private success into an involuntary symbol for larger social problems he never chose to represent but from which he cannot escape. Expert witnesses explained how racial profiling undermines both individual rights and collective security by creating environments where federal personnel face harassment and detention based on racial prejudice rather than legitimate security concerns, compromising national security operations that depend on protecting critical personnel from interference that could provide foreign adversaries intelligence-gathering opportunities. Dr. Beverly Tatum, a recognized expert in racial psychology, testified about the long-term impacts of discrimination on high-achieving black professionals, explaining how incidents like Darius's arrest create trauma that affects performance, relationships, and willingness to participate fully in American society without constant fear of being questioned, challenged, or humiliated based on racial stereotypes. Her testimony helped jurors understand that racial profiling not only violates individual rights, but imposes broader social costs by discouraging talent and achievement within communities that contribute essential knowledge capabilities to American technological leadership and economic competitiveness in increasingly global markets where diversity drives innovation. Statistical experts presented comprehensive analysis of Callahan's arrest patterns, demonstrating with mathematical certainty that his targeting of black motorists exceeded random probability by factors, proving intentional discrimination rather than coincidental enforcement decisions based on legitimate law enforcement criteria or public safety concerns that might justify increased scrutiny. The statistical evidence created objective proof of discriminatory conduct that cannot be explained through alternative theories about crime patterns, neighborhood demographics, or enforcement priorities, establishing a legal foundation for holding both Callahan and his supervisors accountable for civil rights violations that affected dozens of citizens over several years. Austin Police Department supervisors testified about their knowledge of Callahan's conduct and their failure to intervene, despite receiving multiple civilian complaints, alleging racial bias and excessive force, revealing systemic problems in supervision and accountability that allowed discriminatory behavior to continue without consequences or corrective action that could have prevented Darius's arrest. Their testimony exposed the culture of protection and denial that allows problem officers to continue working despite documented evidence of misconduct, creating legal liability for supervisory personnel who failed to fulfill their responsibilities to protect citizens from constitutional violations and civil rights abuses committed by officers under their command. Internal Affairs investigators acknowledged that they dismissed civilian complaints against Callahan without adequate investigation, accepting his explanations and justifications at face value, rather than conducting thorough reviews that could have revealed patterns of discriminatory conduct requiring disciplinary action or additional training to address obvious deficiencies in professional judgment and constitutional compliance. The testimony revealed how police departments protect problem officers through inadequate investigation procedures and lenient disciplinary standards that prioritize departmental loyalty over citizen rights and public safety, creating environments where discrimination can flourish without accountability or deterrent effects that might prevent future violations. Federal investigators presented evidence that Callahan's conduct created security vulnerabilities. Foreign intelligence services could have exploited to gather classified information about NASA programs and defense technologies, demonstrating how racial profiling undermines not only individual rights, but also collective security interests that require protecting critical personnel from harassment and interference. The security implications elevated this case beyond typical civil rights litigation, establishing precedents for federal oversight of local police interactions with classified personnel and creating legal frameworks to prevent future incidents that could compromise national security operations through discriminatory conduct directed at federal contractors and military personnel. Austin's legal representatives attempted to minimize municipal liability by arguing that Callahan acted outside departmental policy and training, but their arguments failed when confronted with evidence that supervisors knew of his discriminatory patterns and took no corrective action that could have prevented constitutional violations and security breaches. The city's defense strategy collapsed when expert testimony revealed that adequate supervision and accountability measures could have prevented this incident through appropriate training, monitoring, and disciplinary action, addressing racial bias, and ensuring constitutional compliance among officers who regularly interact with diverse communities, including federal personnel and classified contractors. Closing arguments framed the case as a choice between accountability and impunity, with Darius's attorneys arguing that significant damages and systemic reforms are necessary to deter future discriminatory conduct and protect constitutional rights that lose meaning without effective enforcement mechanisms, imposing real consequences for violations. The prosecution emphasized that this case represents an opportunity to establish legal precedents protecting all citizens from racial profiling while safeguarding national security interests that depend on ensuring federal personnel can perform their duties without harassment or interference based on racial prejudice, rather than legitimate law enforcement concerns or actual evidence of criminal activity. The federal investigation expanded beyond Callahan's individual misconduct to reveal a deliberate strategy within certain segments of the Austin Police Department to intimidate successful black professionals through selective enforcement and harassment designed to maintain traditional racial hierarchies that economic and educational achievement threatened to disrupt. FBI analysis of departmental communications uncovered coded language and informal policies encouraging officers to subject black motorists to increased scrutiny, particularly those displaying signs of wealth or professional achievement that challenge stereotypical assumptions about appropriate social positioning within racial categories that some officers believe should remain fixed and hierarchical. The investigation revealed that Darius was specifically targeted not despite his success, but because of it, as Callahan and his associates viewed high-achieving black professionals as threats to the established social order, requiring intimidation and humiliation to maintain traditional power structures that racism seeks to preserve through both formal and informal mechanisms of social control. Text messages between Callahan and other officers included explicitly racist comments about black NASA employees and other federal contractors, with particular attention to those driving luxury vehicles or living in prestigious neighborhoods that some officers believe should remain predominantly white, through various means of exclusion and harassment designed to discourage integration and economic advancement. The communications revealed a coordinated effort to monitor and target successful black professionals through database searches, surveillance, and pretext stops designed to create patterns of harassment that would discourage their participation in previously white spaces, while avoiding obvious discrimination that could trigger federal investigation or civil rights prosecution, until Darius's case exposed these systematic practices. Departmental training materials obtained through federal subpoenas contained implicit bias content that experts identified as reinforcing rather than challenging racial stereotypes, with scenario-based exercises consistently portraying black suspects as more dangerous and less credible than white counterparts in identical situations, creating psychological conditioning that justifies discriminatory treatment by appealing to officer safety and professional judgment. Training failures extended to supervisory personnel who received instruction emphasizing officer protection over constitutional compliance, creating a management philosophy that prioritizes departmental solidarity over citizen rights and accountability measures that could prevent civil rights violations or security breaches affecting federal personnel and classified operations, requiring careful interagency coordination. Psychological evaluations of Austin Police Department officers revealed concerning levels of racial resentment and social dominance orientation among personnel assigned to patrol areas with significant populations of black professionals, suggesting that assignment decisions may have been influenced by implicit or explicit preferences for officers whose attitudes align with harassment objectives rather than community service and constitutional compliance that modern democratic policing should prioritize. The evaluations indicated that some officers joined law enforcement specifically to exercise authority over communities they view as inferior or threatening, rather than serving and protecting all citizens equally, regardless of racial background or socioeconomic status, creating recruitment and retention problems that compromise public safety and community trust essential for effective policing in diverse democratic societies. Community advocacy groups presented comprehensive documentation of harassment patterns affecting black professionals throughout Austin, with incident reports spanning several years describing pretext stops, excessive questioning, and deliberate humiliation directed at engineers, doctors, lawyers, and business executives whose success challenges racial stereotypes that some law enforcement personnel appear determined to maintain through intimidation and harassment. The documentation revealed that Darius's arrest was neither an isolated incident nor a random occurrence, but rather the inevitable result of systematic discrimination that affected dozens of successful black citizens who faced similar treatment without achieving the national attention and federal intervention that federal employment and security clearance triggered through established national security protocols designed to protect critical personnel. Congressional investigators examined how local police interference with federal contractors affects national competitiveness and security readiness, with particular attention to whether discriminatory policing discourages minority participation in STEM fields that drive American technological leadership and economic growth in increasingly competitive global markets, where talent determines long-term strategic advantage. Congressional analysis revealed that racial profiling imposes hidden costs on federal agencies and defense contractors that must invest additional resources in security measures and personnel protection that would be unnecessary in environments where constitutional rights receive consistent protection and enforcement regardless of racial identity or social background. International media coverage emphasized how Darius's treatment reflects broader American struggles with racial justice that affect diplomatic relations and cooperative agreements with allied nations, whose citizens observe American civil rights practices as indicators of democratic values and human rights commitments influencing international partnerships in scientific, military, and economic spheres. The international attention created diplomatic complications for American officials who promote democracy and human rights abroad, while struggling to address systematic discrimination at home, particularly involving high-visibility incidents involving federal personnel and national security operations that receive extensive global media coverage and analysis by foreign observers seeking to understand American social dynamics. Corporate executives from major aerospace and technology companies expressed concerns about recruiting and retaining diverse talent in environments where successful professionals face harassment and humiliation based on racial prejudice rather than professional conduct or actual behavior, threatening their ability to compete effectively in global markets, where innovation depends on inclusive workplaces and diverse perspectives. The corporate response emphasized economic arguments for civil rights protection, explaining how discriminatory policing affects business operations, employee morale, and competitive positioning in industries where creativity and collaboration across diverse teams determine success in developing revolutionary technologies and maintaining technological leadership that drives economic growth and national security. Academic researchers documented the broader social costs of racial profiling in professional communities, demonstrating how incidents like Darius's arrest create psychological trauma that affects performance, professional advancement, and willingness to pursue opportunities in fields where excellence should be rewarded rather than punished through harassment and discrimination that waste human capital and undermine meritocratic principles. The research revealed that racial profiling not only harms individual victims, but imposes collective costs on American society by discouraging achievement and participation within communities that contribute essential knowledge capabilities to technological advancement, scientific discovery, and economic innovation that determine national competitiveness and strategic positioning in increasingly knowledge-dominated global markets. Civil rights organizations coordinated national campaigns highlighting how local police misconduct affects federal operations and national security, arguing that constitutional rights require protection not only for moral reasons, but also for practical considerations related to maintaining effective government operations and protecting classified personnel from harassment that could compromise security or provide foreign adversaries intelligence-gathering opportunities. The campaigns emphasized that civil rights and national security represent complementary rather than competing interests, requiring comprehensive approaches addressing both individual justice and collective security through reforms that strengthen constitutional compliance while protecting critical personnel and operations from interference based on racial prejudice, rather than legitimate law enforcement concerns or actual evidence of criminal activity threatening public safety. Public pressure and federal intervention forced radical changes in American law enforcement, as Darius's case became a catalyst for reforms extending far beyond Austin to transform police training, accountability, and oversight mechanisms nationwide, with legislative proposals requiring federal certification for officers interacting with classified personnel and mandatory reporting of discriminatory conduct that could compromise national security operations. The Department of Justice announced a comprehensive investigation of police departments in major metropolitan areas, seeking evidence of systematic discrimination affecting federal contractors and military personnel whose work requires protection from harassment and interference that could provide foreign adversaries intelligence-gathering opportunities or create security vulnerabilities threatening American technological and strategic advantages. Congressional legislation introduced by the House Judiciary Committee established federal oversight mechanisms for local police interactions with classified personnel, creating legal frameworks requiring coordination with federal agencies before detaining or investigating individuals with security clearances while imposing criminal penalties for officers who violate these protocols through discriminatory conduct or failure to follow procedures. The legislation includes provisions for victim compensation, departmental reform, and federal monitoring, ensuring that local law enforcement agencies maintain constitutional compliance and professional standards when dealing with federal personnel whose work contributes to national security and technological competitiveness in increasingly complex global environments where information security determines strategic positioning. Major police unions initially resisted these reforms, arguing that federal oversight undermines local authority and officer discretion. But their opposition collapsed when confronted with overwhelming public support for accountability measures, protecting both constitutional rights and national security interests, requiring careful coordination between law enforcement agencies and federal contractors working on sensitive projects. The unions ultimately negotiated implementation timelines and training programs rather than opposing the reforms outright, recognizing that continued resistance would further damage law enforcement's credibility and professional reputation in communities, demanding both public safety and constitutional compliance from officers sworn to serve and protect all citizens equally, regardless of racial background or social status. Darius became a reluctant spokesperson for police reform, speaking before congressional committees and professional organizations about the personal and national security implications of racial profiling, though he emphasized his preference for systemic change over personal attention and his desire to return to the aerospace engineering work that contributes to American space exploration and technological advancement. His testimony combined personal narrative with technical expertise, explaining how discriminatory policing affects not only individual victims, but also collective security and competitiveness, by creating environments where talented professionals face harassment rather than recognition for their contributions to American leadership in science, technology, and engineering fields that drive economic growth and strategic advantages. The aerospace industry established new protocols for protecting employees from discriminatory law enforcement actions, including legal support funds, federal coordination procedures, and advocacy programs, ensuring that technical personnel can perform their duties without fear of harassment based on racial prejudice rather than actual conduct or legitimate security concerns that might justify law enforcement attention. These protocols emphasize the business case for civil rights protection, demonstrating how discriminatory policing affects industry operations, employee retention, and competitive positioning in global markets, where diverse talent and inclusive environments determine success in developing innovative technologies and maintaining technological leadership that supports both economic growth and national security objectives. Police departments across America began implementing anti-bias training programs developed specifically to address interactions with diverse professional communities, including scenarios designed to challenge stereotypical assumptions about economic achievement, educational level, and appropriate social positioning within racial categories that some officers may maintain unconsciously or deliberately through discriminatory enforcement practices. The training emphasizes constitutional compliance, professional accountability, and community service, rather than enforcement priorities that may reflect personal prejudices or social biases, having no legitimate role in democratic policing that serves all citizens equally, regardless of race, ethnicity, religion, or socioeconomic status within diverse communities contributing to American prosperity and security. Federal agencies established new coordination protocols with local law enforcement to prevent future incidents involving classified personnel, creating communication systems and oversight mechanisms, ensuring appropriate procedures when federal contractors or military personnel become subjects of police investigation for any reason, whether related to their official duties or personal activities that should not compromise security operations. These protocols include immediate notification requirements, federal liaison procedures, and accountability measures, protecting both individual rights and collective security interests while maintaining appropriate separation between federal and local law enforcement responsibilities in democratic systems that depend on checks and balances to prevent abuse of power. The Austin Police Department underwent comprehensive restructuring, including new leadership, revised training programs, enhanced oversight mechanisms, and community engagement initiatives designed to rebuild trust and ensure constitutional compliance in diverse communities that include significant populations of federal contractors, military personnel, and other professionals whose work contributes to national security and economic competitiveness. Chief Briggs announced his retirement as part of the reform process, acknowledging that new leadership is necessary to implement changes and restore public confidence in the department's integrity and professional competence, while expressing regret that inadequate supervision and accountability allowed discriminatory conduct to continue without appropriate intervention that could have prevented constitutional violations and security breaches. Callahan faced federal prosecution for civil rights violations, with possible prison sentences reflecting the serious nature of his misconduct and its impact on both individual victims and national security interests. His conviction established legal precedents for holding officers accountable when discriminatory conduct affects federal personnel or compromises classified operations through harassment and interference. His prosecution sent clear messages to law enforcement personnel nationwide that racial profiling will face serious consequences, particularly when it affects federal contractors or military personnel whose protection requires careful interagency coordination and professional respect for constitutional rights that protect both individual dignity and collective security interests, essential for maintaining democratic governance and the rule of law. Darius's legal settlement with the city of Austin included substantial financial compensation for constitutional violations and personal damages, but more importantly established reform requirements and monitoring mechanisms, ensuring long-term changes in police training, supervision, and accountability that address systematic problems rather than individual misconduct, isolated from broader cultural and institutional factors, allowing discrimination. The settlement emphasized institutional change over punitive damages, reflecting Darius's preference for preventing future incidents rather than maximizing personal compensation, with provisions for ongoing federal oversight and community involvement in police reform efforts, ensuring sustainable progress toward constitutional compliance and professional accountability that serves all citizens equally. Civil rights organizations used Darius's case as the foundation for broader advocacy campaigns targeting systematic discrimination in law enforcement, emphasizing how racial profiling undermines both individual rights and collective security by creating environments where talented professionals face harassment, rather than protection from institutions that should serve and support all citizens, regardless of racial background or social achievements. Years after his arrest transformed him into an involuntary symbol of racial injustice and national security vulnerability, Dr. Darius Ellison made a decision that surprised supporters, critics, and legal experts who expected him to pursue the maximum possible punishment for Officer Callahan and comprehensive litigation against every institution that allowed the discrimination he experienced in that Austin parking lot. Instead of demanding the most severe consequences possible for his tormentor, Darius chose a path demonstrating that true victory lies in transformation rather than vengeance, using his platform and resources to create educational programs that prevent future incidents through understanding and reform, rather than punishment and retribution that might satisfy emotional needs without addressing systematic problems. At a packed press conference at NASA's Johnson Space Center, with his fiancée, Dr. Sofia Morales, at his side and Artemis program colleagues providing professional support. Darius announced the establishment of the Constitutional Compliance and National Security Institute, a comprehensive training program that will prepare law enforcement officers to interact appropriately with diverse professional communities while protecting both individual rights and collective security interests. His decision reflected months of careful consideration about how to transform personal trauma into positive change, addressing root causes rather than symptoms, choosing educational intervention over punitive measures that might provide satisfaction without creating lasting improvement in police training, community relations, and constitutional compliance that protects all citizens. The Institute's curriculum combines civil rights education with national security awareness, teaching officers to recognize legitimate federal credentials, understand the importance of protecting classified personnel, and appreciate how discriminatory conduct undermines both individual dignity and collective security in democratic societies that depend on trust between institutions and the communities they serve. Darius explained that his engineering background taught him to solve problems systematically rather than simply identifying failures, and he believes sustainable change requires addressing the knowledge gaps, cultural biases, and institutional structures that allowed his arrest, rather than focusing solely on punishing individuals whose misconduct reflects broader problems within police training systems and accountability structures. The Institute partners with law enforcement academies, federal agencies, and civil rights organizations to develop comprehensive training programs addressing implicit bias, constitutional compliance, and professional accountability through realistic scenarios, expert instruction, and continuous evaluation. Ensuring officers understand both legal requirements and ethical obligations when serving diverse communities that include federal contractors and classified personnel. Darius participates personally in training sessions, sharing his experience not to humiliate officers, but to help them understand how their assumptions and actions affect real people whose work contributes to American security and prosperity, emphasizing that protecting constitutional rights strengthens rather than undermines effective law enforcement in democratic societies requiring public trust and community cooperation. Officer Brent Callahan, who served a prison term for civil rights violations and faces a lifetime ban from law enforcement employment, expressed genuine remorse for his conduct and requested permission to participate in the Institute's programs as an example of how racial prejudice distorts professional judgment and creates dangers for both citizens and officers who fail to meet constitutional standards. His participation, approved after extensive consultation with civil rights experts and community leaders, provides powerful testimony about the personal and professional costs of discrimination, while demonstrating that redemption and education offer better paths forward than permanent condemnation and social exclusion that might prevent learning and growth. The Institute's impact extends far beyond individual training sessions to influence police academy curricula, departmental policies, and federal oversight mechanisms, ensuring constitutional compliance and professional accountability in law enforcement agencies nationwide, with evaluation systems, measuring progress in reducing discriminatory conduct, and improving community relations across diverse populations that include federal personnel and classified contractors. Darius's approach received initial skepticism from some civil rights advocates who prefer more aggressive accountability measures, but his results demonstrate that educational intervention creates more sustainable change than purely punitive approaches that might satisfy justice concerns without addressing systematic problems or preventing future incidents through improved training and professional development. The Department of Justice adopted the Institute's training materials as standard curricula for federal law enforcement agencies and recommended their use by state and local departments seeking federal funding and cooperation, creating incentives for widespread adoption of constitutional compliance training that protects both individual rights and national security interests through better preparation and continuous education. Major corporations in aerospace, defense, and technology industries provide funding and partnership opportunities, ensuring the Institute's long-term sustainability while creating career development pathways for law enforcement officers who demonstrate commitment to constitutional compliance and professional excellence in serving diverse communities that drive American economic competitiveness and technological innovation. The Institute's success led to expansion opportunities, including international partnerships with democratic nations, seeking to improve police training and community relations, demonstrating how American leadership in civil rights education can enhance diplomatic relations and cooperative agreements in regions where human rights protection influences political stability and economic development, affecting global security and prosperity. Darius returned to his aerospace engineering work with renewed purpose, understanding that his experience, though traumatic, created opportunities to contribute both to space exploration and to civil rights advancement through practical solutions addressing real problems affecting individuals and institutions throughout American society. His technical work on the Artemis program continues uninterrupted, though his public profile now includes advocacy responsibilities. He embraces as extensions of his commitment to service and excellence, rather than distractions from his primary professional interests and expertise in rocket propulsion systems. The Tesla that became evidence in his arrest now serves as his daily transportation to the Institute's headquarters, where he works part-time developing curricula and training materials that help law enforcement officers understand their constitutional obligations and professional responsibilities when serving communities that include federal contractors, military personnel, and other citizens whose work contributes to national security and economic competitiveness. His decision to transform trauma into education, rather than pursue maximum punishment, reflects his understanding that lasting change requires building bridges rather than walls, creating opportunities for learning and growth that benefit both law enforcement professionals and the communities they serve through better training, enhanced accountability, and strengthened trust, supporting both public safety and constitutional rights. The unexpected choice of education over retribution demonstrates how true leadership sometimes requires choosing difficult paths that prioritize collective benefit over personal satisfaction, using painful experiences as foundations for positive change that prevents future suffering, rather than simply punishing past mistakes, without creating frameworks for improvement and professional development. Darius's story continues to inspire others facing discrimination and injustice, proving that individual responses to systematic problems can create ripple effects that transform institutions and communities through persistent commitment to principles of dignity, respect, and constitutional compliance that protect everyone's rights while strengthening democratic governance and social cohesion. As he reflects on his journey from handcuffed and humiliated to respected advocate and educator, Darius recognizes that his greatest victory lies not in defeating his opponents, but in transforming them into allies who share his commitment to justice, equality, and the excellence that characterizes the best of American values and democratic ideals that continue evolving through citizen participation and institutional reform. Have you ever considered how personal trauma can become a catalyst for positive social change that benefits everyone involved? Darius Ellison's decision to choose education over retribution challenges us to think differently about justice, accountability, and the true meaning of victory in the face of discrimination and injustice. His story demonstrates that sustainable change often requires building bridges rather than walls, creating opportunities for learning and growth that strengthen rather than divide our communities and institutions. What do you think about his decision to transform his painful experience into educational programs that prevent future incidents, rather than pursuing maximum punishment for those who harmed him? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story inspired you to think differently about justice and reconciliation, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories exploring the complexities of civil rights, national security, and personal courage in contemporary America. Don't forget to share this story with others who might benefit from Darius's example of how individual responses to systematic problems can create positive change that protects everyone's constitutional rights while strengthening the democratic values that make America a beacon of hope and opportunity for people of all backgrounds and walks of life.